I'm Sabina, I'm the head of EU and trade policy at techUK, and I run this series of webinars that we've been doing now for 10 weeks on the future of basically various sectors of the economy in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic and how tech can help with the resilience and recovery of our economies. So this is week 10. If you've been here before, welcome back. If this is your first time, please do come back. We'll run this through the summer and looking at, from healthcare to cybersecurity to public services, future of emerging technologies and so on. Today we are focusing on a topic very dear to my heart. I used to work for the European Union for 10 years before I joined techUK. So we are focusing today on the future of the EU tech agenda. And for that, we are very happy to have Aline from the Centre for Data Innovation moderate this conversation. So I'll pass over to her. You are all muted, so whenever you have to speak, you need to unmute yourself, and please use the chat function for questions. Aline, over to you. Aline, you're muted.
It still happens after months of practicing on this platform. Thank you, Sabina, and thank you, Kay, for organizing this and having me. And good morning or good afternoon to you all. I'm delighted to moderate such a good panel for our participants. Thank you for joining. There are many of you today, which is proof, if needed be, that there's a lot of attention being paid to that topic. Please indeed write your questions in the Q&A section of the platform, and perhaps who the question is meant for, so we can pick them up later for our discussions. A small reminder or disclaimer that the discussion is taking place via the Zoom platform. It's being live streamed and recorded, and the recorded will be used in a roundup of the event, which will be published on techUK's website afterwards. So today we have an ambitious topic indeed for our discussion, as it's nothing less than what the EU tech agenda may or should look like as we're entering a post-COVID-19 crisis. A little bit of context to start with. Before things started to look pretty bad for what we know as normal conditions, for the policy processes we know and for our economy, the EU had rolled out what is probably one of its most ambitious agendas, with a big push for tech policy, with a number of, let's say, ammunitions in a nutshell, a digital strategy, including the white paper, the data strategy, a Digital Services Act package, and in this, other initiatives such as, reform of competition rules and industrial strategy, as this is more or less always interconnected these days. So then when the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, people closely watched the timeline of the Commission, as some of the consultations and legislations and other steps were postponed, but only a few really were, and most of that remains unchecked and unchanged and on track. And digital remains very much a priority, and the Commission is currently consulting or reviewing consultation responses. But it is hard not to want to wonder what sorts of impacts the changes we've experienced might have, will have, and should have substantially on EU tech priorities and the strategic thinking behind them. We do hear that we need a future-proof EU tech agenda. We need to reinvent the EU economy with digital as one of its pillars, that we should not rebuild the old world, as Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager recalled this morning again. But really, there are many concrete aspects to discuss in this respect for how to get there. So with us today, to make sure to go into this in more detail, we have the privilege to welcome Werner Stengt, Cabinet Member of the Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager at the European Commission, Sarah Cameron, Legal Director at Pinsent Masons, which is a large international firm, which specializes in various strategic sectors, including tech. We have Cameron, Kerry, Anne R. and Andrew H. Tisch, Distinguished Fellow in Governance Studies at the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution, whose perspective will include insights about the transatlantic relationship, I'm sure. and Elizabeth Crossick, Head of EU Government Affairs at RELEX Group, which is a global provider of information-based analytics. Thank you very much to you all for joining. Our panelists will have a few minutes to provide an opening statement and react to each other's comments and to some of the follow-up questions that we've prepared, and then we'll turn to the audience as mentioned to allow for as much interaction as possible. Now, to start with, I'd like to give the word to you, Werner, for your opening statement, and perhaps can you share also what does success in tech look like for the EU, according to the EU? And also the COVID-19 crisis has given more momentum to digital and more urgency to the Commission's plans on tech policies, it seems. Among all the strategies and proposals lined up, maybe there's one where the Commission's thinking has evolved the most, and maybe there's one that is most advanced compared to others. The floor is yours, Werner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eileen, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to my kids' room. So if at any point in the next 5 to 7 minutes you see a kid behind me, that's not virtual, that's very real. I mean, COVID, of course, has shown what digital can do when nothing else works anymore. I think this was a crash course for all of us in the last 3 months, whether it was shopping when all other shops were closed, communicating when you couldn't meet anybody personally, schooling from a distance when schools were closed, teleworking anyway. So a fantastic test, which has shown how important digital is, and that digital will be even more important as from now on than it was already 3 months ago when we issued our digital strategy, if you want. So in that sense, COVID has not changed our policy. It has just shown how super relevant it is, because what did we say at the beginning of this mandate? We said promoting digital is one of the key priorities of this Commission, right? Alongside the green transition, but a lot of the green transition is coming through digital anyway, right? So digital all over the place. And then we came in 3 months later and with our strategy package, and we called it Shaping Europe's Digital Future, which sort of suggested it needs shaping and it can be shaped, because we used that title on purpose. We said, well, digital is wonderful, or let's put it differently, digital in all its dimensions can do wonderful things, but we have to make sure that it does wonderful things, right? From artificial intelligence to data to the platform economy to whatever other issue we're going to discuss in this hour. They're very, very positive things, but we need to take care that digital is used and deployed in a way that serves our society, that serves our economy, that serves our people, serves our citizens. That was the whole purpose of this digital package. We always refer to excellence and trust, and not just in artificial intelligence, but overall, right? We want to be a strong digital player in Europe. That's also one of the dimensions, of course, that as Europe, we want to play a stronger role in digital than we may have played in the first wave of digitization. We want to do that in a way, however, that reflects our values and rights and the sense of purpose that we have in Europe. So we said we want technology with a purpose. We want markets actually to give everyone a chance to perform on those markets. We also want a society that, in a way, or to live in a society where digital enhances our societal values rather than undermining them, where democracy is upheld, where information can flow freely, where there is transparency. Opinion is more important than that technology does serve a purpose, that our markets are open. More and more businesses will go online now, or have done so in the last 3 months, because this was the only channel that still worked. So if they rely on platforms, if they compete with platforms, it's even more important than before that we have fair market conditions, if you want. If more and more people shop online or consume content online on social media or elsewhere, the Digital Services Act is more important than ever, because we don't want to have our citizens exposed to unsafe products or illegal content. So therefore, that part of the agenda is more relevant. We have also seen how important it is, of course, that issues like cybersecurity cybersecurity are being addressed. Again, the more we rely on digital, the more vulnerable we are to cybersecurity. The skills agenda is becoming more important than ever. So in a way, all of the issues that were close to our hearts 3 months ago are even closer to our hearts now. And I'm really looking forward to what the other panelists have to say, and then of course also to the Q&A session of where everybody thinks we should.
Oh, you've just been muted. Oh, yeah, okay, so you were finished. Thank you very much, Werner. And I think we had a couple of, a bit of a connection problem with you. I hope it will be stable from now on. Thanks for your comments. I wanted to turn to you, Sarah, next, to hear from you, your opening remarks, how you look at this topic from your perspective, and what does success mean in tech for the EU, in your view?
Thanks so much, Alina. It's a great pleasure to be joining you. So I start from the same position really as Werner to reflect on our indebtedness to the technology sector really, and the recognition that we all now have of the criticality of connectivity for all the reasons that Werner has just outlined. But not least our indebtedness for all the many examples of tech for good that we've seen over the last few weeks. I think the upshot of this is that connectivity needs to be seen as an essential service for all, so that nobody is left behind. And looking to the recovery and how tech will be central to this, it's more important than ever that we turbocharge investment into the low carbon economy and green tech, digital health, and upgrading skills in the digital arena as well. And governments need to send out strong signals so that money flows to the right places according to our values. And we've heard talk of the Marshall Plan from the EU, similar language in the UK, and certainly Carolyn Fairbairn urging the investment in the green tech agenda and upskilling the workforce. When we look to productivity and the economic recovery, we also need to focus on resilience. And this includes 5G, of course, key to the industrial Internet of Things. But also from the social perspective, this appreciation that resilience includes the link between health and the economy. What we've seen fantastic examples of during the last few weeks is collaboration, so between competing businesses, but also between government and business. And if we can maintain that sort of cooperation and agility, we can make rapid progress in our search for economic recovery. Just a couple of words on the tech sector itself. There's a very mixed picture as to how it's faring. A recent survey, now a couple of months old, suggested that about 60% in the sector thought they would suffer no more than a moderate impact. But the small side, the small tech businesses are likely to be disproportionately affected. And it's very important that they are helped to survive and thrive and not disappear or all be bought up. But turning to the EU digital strategy itself, I think a lot of the points have been made, as Werner says, just emphasise that their strategy is very largely on message and frankly chimes with a lot of the key objectives that we have in this country around trust in the data economy, digital skills, access to data and so on. But just mentioning a couple of specifics, if I may, overhauling the e-commerce directive after 20 years, clearly needed, opportunity to harmonise and remedy any fragmentation there's been, but the perfect time to have this discussion around illegal content online and the allocation of responsibility and liability there. But when we come to the wider competition elements in the Digital Services Act and the parallel competition tool, I think we're going to see an intense debate here. I noticed that there have been 900 plus amendments to the Saliba report, and everyone you talk to has a different view. It's an area of intense international focus as a topic. Turning to the data strategy itself, I would overall congratulate the EU on their holistic approach to this and would agree with many of the high-level aims and ambitions, but would stress the critical need to work really closely with industry. to make sure that innovation is not stifled by some of those initiatives, that regulation is only pursued where really necessary. For example, perhaps public safety risks vis-a-vis consumers for AI. But again, a detailed discussion is needed in this area. In terms of access to data, data is going to increase 500% in the next 5 years, a potential of 829 billion euros worth of value to the EU. This area is one of particular interest to me and to Pinsent Masons, because we were advisors in the ODI Pilot Data Trusts project last year. And this is a complex landscape. We talk of open data, and yes, great progress has been made with the public sector, but with the private sector, rather than jumping to mandating data sharing, we should look to incentivize and assist adopting some of these relatively new initiatives, engaging stakeholders and considering all the relevant commercial interests. An exciting area too is the maturing of the privacy enhancing technologies, and I think a lot can be done here to nurture and encourage data sharing between businesses, in a way protecting those interests. And just before I close, a quick word on AI. I'm a great believer in the fact that AI should be looked at as a great force for good, huge positivity there, but with risks that need managing, not the other way around. It can create thousands of jobs and drive significant growth. But there is consensus too that most of the existing regulations and laws largely cover what's required for AI, including liability. There may be some gaps and high risks to address. This will come down to a balance and evaluation of risk, as I say, such as public safety risks potentially, and strict liability potentially vis-a-vis the consumer. But when dealing with attribution and liability between businesses, I think there'll be a strong argument for businesses to address this risk between themselves. And any conversation around reversing burdens of proof or what have you needs a very close consideration with business, so that you don't end up stifling the very achievements that you're setting out to achieve. Strong governance frameworks can play a major role here, I think, that fit with the wider principles broadly agreed around the ethics of AI. And I commend the work of the ICO with its audit framework in that regard. The reality is probably that high risks need to be looked at from a sector perspective. So overall, my comments would be that I think the EU work is largely very well intentioned. They have a powerful presence. If we can have strong collaboration with industry bodies, but also internationally on areas of international focus, then great progress can be made, and we can look forward to a thriving economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for such insightful remarks that packs a punch. You mentioned no one should be left behind, how important it is to make sure the money flows to the right places. Investment is key. And also, I gather you really want to insist on the importance between government and businesses. As collaboration was key during the crisis and will continue to be key. Fragmentation is a challenge that I think the EU is ready to tackle head on very seriously. And you recommend really caution when it comes to moving to more regulation, perhaps avoiding an overlap of existing rules or replication of existing rules. I think it makes sense here to turn to you, Elizabeth, from RELEX perspective. I know you've seen firsthand and initiated good examples at RELEX of how to combine customer understanding, expertise, the latest technology, how to bring together, tech expertise, data scientists, and how necessary it has been over the past few months. So perhaps you could tell us something about that as well as part of your opening remarks, and how that can be part of an agenda shared between policymakers, experts, society, industry. So please, the floor is yours, Elizabeth.
Thank you. And Sarah, it's amazing how aligned we are. I think you could give my presentation. It's quite funny. I think because there are probably a few people on this call who may not know who RELEX is, I just want to share that, or to say a little bit about who we are. We are, as you said, in this, the outcome at the outset, we're a global provider of information-based analytics and decision tools, and we cover lots of different sectors. So some of us know us for medical, healthcare and science, but actually we're also involved in financial services, energy, all sorts of different areas. Headquartered in Europe, we're one of the world's leading developers and users of machine learning technology, and we've successfully grown that to other markets, including the US and Asia, which accounts for about half of our revenue. So it's not only Silicon Valley coming to Europe. AI is a keen interest for all our RELX businesses, you wouldn't be surprised to know. We invest about 1.3 billion euros in technology a year. We have about 9,000 technologists, many of whom are in Europe. And we have tech hubs in London and Amsterdam. We're probably better known through our brands such as LexisNexis, Elsevier, for those of you in Brussels, MLEX, but we're also behind the scenes in many of our daily interactions. So for example, I don't know if anyone from Netflix is listening, but our fraud detection software is utilized when we set up and use accounts on many of our favorite websites, Netflix being one, Uber another. It's also our data that helps inform Rolls-Royce as to how their engines are performing. So a very diverse set of things that we do. And in some ways, I suppose COVID demonstrates how connected the world is, not just in sharing the dreadful disease itself, but also in trying to find solutions, whether those are cures, vaccinations, or sharing best practice. I'm sure many companies and organizations here today have contributed in their own unique way to helping solve the COVID-19 problems. And we of course have, and if anyone's interested, I've got a few quite interesting examples if we get into the conversation. But I'd like to move to the tech agenda and say more than ever that COVID reminds us how interconnected the world is. It doesn't respect and it doesn't even recognize borders. And the same could be said for technology. So I think it's even more important that when we're setting rules and standards in this space, we also work globally. As Europe builds up its digital infrastructure and removes barriers to a single market for data, which we greatly support, we should take care this doesn't interfere with openness and data flows. And actually, furthermore, a little pet peeve of mine, a universal definition of AI would be extremely helpful. Staying on the topic of AI and data, Werner touched on the skills agenda, absolutely agree with you. We also think there's actually a useful exercise to be run by the Commission to help bring together resources to improve citizens' understanding of AI, and I think Sarah touched upon this as well. It's really important that individuals feel empowered to interact, not just because they have regulatory safeguards, but because they better understand the benefits, not just the risks it can bring them. I think that's crucial to not just a broader uptake, but broader trust in AI. Just a few small points on the strategy that the panel has been asked to consider. The first is that from the perspective of a data-intensive company, I'd say not all data is equal. And this is an element that's often missing from these discussions. The outcomes from AI applications of systems can only be as good as the underlying data that are fed into the algorithms. And quality, clean data inputs have a better chance of leading to quality outputs and therefore better income, and therefore better outcomes. Now, when it comes to advertising or recommenders, quality is less important. We will all engage or not, depending on our own personal choice. But when it comes to, say, drug outcomes, which have material impact on people's lives, it becomes extremely important. One way of supporting this is ensuring a robust and flexible IP regime in the EU. This will help guarantee a successful AI sector by incentivizing creativity and ensuring those breaking the rules aren't rewarded. I would also add that we're delighted that the EU puts data at the top of its agenda, and note that one of the most important components to help the EU accelerate in this space is access to public data, for which the full implementation of the Open Data Directive by all member states is imperative. My second point relates to the relationship between AI and GDPR. The EU's white paper presents various policy options in terms of regulation, and there is, as the white paper notes, an extensive body of existing legislation that's applicable but may well need updating. One area we would welcome some adjustment on is the application of GDPR on AI. The white paper identifies specific concerns relating to bias and discrimination, but GDPR makes it extremely difficult to test for bias within training data due to the restrictions on collecting that sensitive data in the first place. And finally, on the DSA and reform of the e-commerce directive, notice and take down should mean notice and stay down, following both the European Court jurisprudence and the Copyright Directive, which notes that platforms must act expeditiously to disable access and make best efforts to prevent their future uploads. We would suggest adding that to the DSA would be a logical extension. On liability, there's been much discussion about this distinction between active and passive and when the latter lose their exemption. The DSA roadmap refers to this under option 3. We welcome clarification, but caution against any introduction of the so-called Good Samaritan approach, not least because it hasn't brought any legal certainty in the US where it's best known. And we think it would totally redefine the current EU legal framework that relies on the e-commerce directive articles 12 to 15 and could leave rights holders with an overly broad principle that would be difficult to enforce. There's also been some discussion on duty of care. The larger the platform, the greater the obligation. It's not clear to me how one can reconcile this concept without completely changing the liability rules. Furthermore, it isn't always size that matters. A small platform that intermediates the sale of products, some of which are unsafe and potentially lethal to consumers, should surely not be less responsible than its larger competitor. RELX is, of course, responding to all the consultations, and we're looking forward to being partners in creating a future-proof tech agenda. We think this future calls for a pragmatic approach from all stakeholders. The more we can do things like this and discuss and explore together during pre-legislative phases, the better we will understand different points of view and potentially find solutions. It also means ensuring any legislation introduced is technology neutral and avoids being over-prescriptive. We are convinced that with the right conditions and through the twin ecosystems of excellence and trust, technology and AI will flourish in Europe, and we are delighted to be part of that discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth, for your very clear and thoughtful and comprehensive comments. I'm sure RELX is on top of the consultations the Commission has issued. Everybody, just in case, you have until Sunday to submit the one for the AI white paper. You did mention, it's interesting, just a side note, this intellectual property as something quite important, and it often tends to be forgotten in the AI conversation, so thanks for that. Again, you mentioned the importance of money, of investment. Pooling resources will be ever more essential now that we have this looming economic recession. And again, the importance of avoiding fragmentation. And it does make sense here to move to you, Cameron, from Brookings. So, we know there are tensions in the US-EU relationship, but also in terms of the direction of some policies, talking about fragmentation, for instance, with your approach on illegal online content. What do you think should drive the EU approach for it to be successful, and perhaps then in framing it with the transatlantic relationship more precisely even, what are some of the expectations you think of transatlantic partners when looking at the EU, and what does a successful EU look like to them? Thanks. Floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Eileen, and it's good to be here. Let me build a little bit on what some of the other panelists have said. I mean, Werner, indicated that one of the drivers of EU policy is a sense that the EU needs to play catch up, that it's been a little bit of a laggard in tech development and the digital economy, but clearly has taken a position of leadership in terms of digital policy. And somebody who, when I was in government, made the digital economy a priority of the Commerce Department and tried to elevate its importance in government policy making. I have admiration for that, and we are seeing the products of that, as you alluded to, Eileen. We're coming to the end of one consultation period on the AI white paper, just as consultation opens on the DSA. So a lot going on, and in fact, tomorrow at this time, I will be leading a high-level discussion of the EU, DG Connect, and other parts of the Commission White House officials, UK, digital media and sport, as well as the Canadian Ministry of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development, talking about the opportunities for transatlantic cooperation in AI. And I think from the discussions that I've had, I think there is a lot of interest in this topic among all of the governments, in spite of some of the tensions, in spite of some of the rhetoric that we see in the US side. I think there is a recognition that this is an important area for cooperation because of shared values, because we together, the EU and the United States make up about half of the world's GDP and a third of the world's trade flows. We are inexorably linked. And here there's an important opportunity to collaborate. I mean, I think to some respects, the AI white paper recognizes comparative advantages that the EU does well in robotics, in machine-based AI, but that there are advantages on the other side. And Canada, for example, has been a leader in this area. It's the first country to adopt a national AI strategy. And interestingly, outsourced much of that to CFAR, an independent think tank. And I think that reflects what will be part of the discussion tomorrow is the role of the private sector, the role of experts in these discussions. So I sort of echo what Sarah said about sort of the importance of that engagement. Government officials are not, by and large, technologists, and it really takes the input and understanding of what is happening on the ground. And I think what we're seeing in this discussion tomorrow is, I think, recognition on the part of all of the governments of the importance of that. And I think the opportunity here is in a couple of respects. I mentioned certainly comparative advantage and the opportunity to operate at scale in knowledge, in the sharing of knowledge, in data sharing. It's really a great comparative advantage that China has is the scale on which it can collect and analyze data. Liberal democratic countries are not going to operate in that way. So we need to find ways to accomplish the same things together. And I think the great opportunity that we have collectively in the area of AI in particular is that from a regulatory standpoint, from a policy standpoint, this is still very much a green field. So we can both, we're not encumbered by existing regulation in how we collaborate. And so there's the opportunity to do that in ways that can harmonize, that can be interoperable. And I think that needs to be an important part of the focus of policymaking. I think that certainly applies in other areas as well, but certainly the greatest opportunities I see are in AI. So look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Cam, and I have a lot of questions, but just to remind our participants, they can also chip in and pose their own questions in the Q&A tab, so we can later take a look. Thank you for your remarks. I think it's interesting you put it in a sort of the greenfield collaboration in many respects still in this field, and there are concrete ways to cooperate, and there's a recognition on both sides that it could be mutually beneficial. And you mentioned there's an opportunity in comparative advantage and also in terms of scale. But also, I wonder, I'm turning to Werner now, actually, for this. Europe really wants to make sure its values are recognized and respected. And perhaps, you know, some like Elizabeth stressed the importance that it's important to make sure to remain open in whatever strategic endeavors we take at EU level. Some have raised concerns that EU's data strategy is flirting with what has a bit of a protectionist foretaste, you know, data localism, data digital sovereignty would be too defensive and send the wrong signal. So I'm wondering, to what extent would these concerns be justified? What role do you see for EU partners in supporting its tech agenda and capabilities? And back to the value matter, isn't the EU's best chance to defend its value through cooperation with its allies to secure its digital sovereignty, especially given you know, challenges to resources and investments?
Yeah, very good questions. I hope you can hear my answers, because in the neighboring house they start construction works right now. So anyway, we've gone through this before. Now the question has been with us for quite a while already, of course, in the run-up to the strategy package of February, when we had used language like you know, digital sovereignty, when we talked about data and training of data on AI in Europe and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of debate around that, also quite some misunderstandings, I think. Our view is that Europe is not turning more protectionist when it comes to digital, but rather more confident and assertive. And we would not want to confuse being assertive with being protectionist, right? We're saying we are Europe. We have a lot of talent. We have a big market as well. We want to play a stronger role in digital matters, having been a bit weak in the first wave of, you know, consumer-facing platforms, if you want. We think we have what it takes to succeed in the next generation of digital technologies and their use. So from data to AI to what have you. We have a strong industrial base, and so using that base together with digital tools can make a huge difference. So that's one thing, if you want, in terms of competitiveness. We just want to be able to do certain things. We want to reduce dependency and become a strong player in our own right. And that is which explains all the excellence type of policies. Also the investment part, which was rightly flagged by Sarah and others, because of course we are saying that this doesn't fall from like manna from heaven, but that we need to invest more strongly into those critical technologies. And that's why we are proposing this Digital Europe program to finance technologies. And also in the recovery program that we have just proposed a week ago, we put a lot of emphasis on the need to invest now into the technologies that will help us to prosper tomorrow. And a lot of that is, of course, starts from connectivity to technology. But it doesn't, this sort of, if we believe in our values, which we do, and we say we want to shape our digital future in a way that respects our values, our rights, our convictions, then first of all, a precondition is that you're doing that yourself, because it would be very difficult to say, well, we don't, you know, create any AI solutions ourselves, but we have very strong expectations in terms of values. But then we depend entirely on third countries to supply us with such technology. So it's easier if you are strong yourself, and that hopefully also helps you to influence the global agenda, as we did on GDPR and in other areas, if you want. I mean, Cameron said we have leadership on digital policy. So we are also exporter, we hope, of the way in which things are being done, hopefully in future also of the things themselves. Then it's also important that we are able to enforce rights in Europe. And that was a bit of debate about data and AI. So if we are saying AI solutions deployed in Europe should meet certain standards when it comes to high risk applications, right? Then we were not protectionists, but we were saying it doesn't matter whether such technology is being developed in Europe or whether we buy it in. We must make sure that we're able to enforce these policies. And this is in a non-discriminatory way. Obviously, our objective is to work with the like-minded countries across the globe. Well, naturally, and we have been doing so from AI an example where we've worked in many international fora where we want to collaborate, especially with the like-minded countries, those that have similar value systems than we have. Of course, we want to do that. We're just starting out from sort of this feeling of confidence and assertiveness that we're saying, well, that's what we are, that's what we want. And then we are happy to engage with anybody who is sharing our values. And probably to stop this longish intervention, probably, we have moved probably to a new language from digital sovereignty, which was being interpreted in many different ways, to yet another very nice one, which is strategic open autonomy. I think Commissioner Hogan has used that repeatedly, and I think that's a very nice description. It's strategic, it's open, but we also want to be independent and autonomous as much as we can.
Thank you very much once more for your interesting response. I happen to have heard Ethno's director, Lise Freer, this morning referring to digital leadership as an alternative concept, which why not could also be interesting. Turning to Sarah and then Elizabeth and then Cameron for last comment. So I was wondering, you probably want to react on what you've heard, so I would let you do that, but also maybe adding to that, have a more precise questions on what's the vibe in the UK that you're seeing. You know, is there similar, does that resonate, this sovereignty discourse or objective? Is that something that you can comment on? Sarah, perhaps you can go first if you like.
Yes, so I find those comments from Werner really reassuring about what you were saying about the sovereignty agenda, because language is really powerful and can send out very strong signals. And subjectively, when I first heard talk of digital sovereignty, data sovereignty, technical sovereignty, it did indicate some sort of protectionist signal. But actually, when you read the detail and hear how Werner has put that so clearly, it's understandable that the EU seeks to be less dependent on foreign infrastructure and cloud provision. The cloud market has been totally dominated by US companies, and it's perfectly legitimate for the EU and others to try and find legitimate ways of rectifying that balance. And there is plenty of talent within the EU and a strong base to achieve that. Lots of opportunities also exist as we move to more real-time data and a shift to edge computing as well. So I'm comforted by what I've heard. We know that if you want to do business with Europe, you have to abide by their rules, and the reference to the GDPR is the classic example that has become effectively a global standard. So I think no surprises there. So from the UK perspective, we share a lot of the same values. It would be interesting to hear actually what Sabina has to say, if anything, about the tech community and comments on this. But my main remark is to say that I'm reassured by those comments, because I think some of the agenda items around the data spaces and the data strategy left quite a lot of room for ambiguity as to what the ambition was and how closed or open the agenda is there.
Thank you. Turning to you, Elizabeth, did you want to chip in on that? Oop, you are on mute.
Yeah, so not very much to add. I'm also comforted by Werner's words. I hope that others in the Commission have the same view, because ultimately the devil is in the detail. but I don't think anyone would disagree that if you're playing in Europe, you should abide by Europe's rules. I think that makes total and utter sense. But it's just how we move forward with this, and I think I've referred to it quite a lot in my presentation, so I won't take up more time here. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Cameron, so I will let you react on that, but I also would like to know, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack here. How can, for instance, could you elaborate your response, maybe mentioning how can such alliances between EU and partners be useful, and do you see any examples of cooperation that can reinvigorate tech policy that's transatlantic? That's maybe you want to comment on these calls to support an AI framework led by the US NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technologies. You've probably heard about that. Do you see it maybe as a response to the EU leading the charge in the regulatory playground, as maybe US firms worry that their own leaders will be playing catch up? So just thought if you wanted to comment, please do.
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting things about this discussion is that it's important to, I think, differentiate between the political rhetoric and the application. I mean, certainly the language of digital sovereignty, yes, Sarah, language is important, certainly set off some alarm bells. But so has language about America first and looking down on multilateral institutions, of which the European Union is one. But I think there are certainly differences in the way that this is playing out. I'm seeing on the EU side in some of the issues raised in the white paper, a lot of pragmatism about what it will actually take to develop AI, and as Werner talked about, the importance of investment, the importance of stakeholder involvement. And similarly on, this is true on the US side as well. The discussion we're having tomorrow is one example, but we've seen in areas of criminal justice and implementation of the Cloud Act, recognition of the value of the EU, same in trade. And that's true in the digital area as well, where over the past couple of years, the US has stepped up its involvement in the OECD discussions around AI, recognizing that if we are going to sustain successful development in this area and trade based on this, it's going to take cooperation with with like-minded countries. I think a lot depends, certainly when it comes to EU policies, what it means to do AI based on EU rules. So I think understanding is that means GDPR will apply. It will mean consumer protection rules apply. But if it is the EU unilaterally setting the rules going forward, then I think that will be a challenge. But I think we need to keep an eye out on that the Brussels effect may give way to a Beijing effect. So I think that creates important incentives to continue cooperation.
Thank you. And I think some fear that if Trump is re-elected, the transatlantic relationship may not improve. It's also interesting, however, to note that the US recently decided to join eventually the GPAI, the Global Partnership on AI, which is French-Canadian initiative, OECD more or less, G7. Thank you for your comments. We do have a couple of questions that popped in. I wanted to get back to Werner before we do one last final question. So there are two things here I'd like to have your response on. we have a question about the point Elizabeth made regarding the intersection of GDPR and AI. And a question I wanted to ask you now, okay, the AI white paper consultation ends on Sunday, but there's this DFA consultation that just opened. I was wondering how you're looking at the process. What are some of the points of contention, but also encouraging signals? You know, there's so many different things to tackle in there. This gatekeeper role of platforms, online advertising, new competition tool. I wondered if you could share your expectations on this consultation, and whether you could share something about the Commission's thinking on what Elizabeth mentioned too, the Good Samaritan, duty of care, and perhaps this EU-wide body, a supervisory body that many MEPs report mentioned. So not giving you any more questions, just floor is yours.
Goodness me, how much time have you got? From the first part, Elizabeth's point on GDPR and AI, of course, that's an important dimension that is being consulted on and looked at. What is the relationship between the two? Is one potential obstacle to the other? Is it just a question of lack of clarity? Is more guidance needed, and so on and so forth? Some of the issues, of course, will also be addressed in, for instance, the data strategy itself, when we were talking about data spaces, for instance, right? And one of the key questions, if let's say you want to create a data space in the area of health, there, of course, you have very strong GDPR implications, probably much stronger than if you were to create a data space in agriculture to promote precision farming, right? So it is also not just a horizontal issue, one size fits all, GDPR and AI, but you may need to address the issue from different angles depending on the context. So if you were to create a European data space for health, then you have to make sure that given the specificities and sensitivities of health-related data, you need governance structures in place and legal clarity in place that evacuate also any doubt and how and what data can be used in a health data space, right? So sometimes you may need additional legal clarifications and governance structures also to provide the legal certainty for anybody trying to become active in this space. Yeah, so I don't think I can give a more specific answer than that. This may have to be looked a bit also on an ad hoc basis. The DSA question is a vast one. You've seen the consultation has started after, of course, months and months of discussions already, ever since the first drafts were leaked more than a year ago when I was still in charge of this. So you have really on the one hand the e-commerce directive revision, which will always be a self-standing piece, yeah, just as a starting point, even if there is 3 things that are being consulted on in parallel: the ECD revision, the market power tool ex ante for dominant platforms, and the competition tool. These are 3 self-standing initiatives. They're all interrelated. That's why we consult on them in parallel, but it's not going to be one mega regulation or proposal. So the ECD is really about the single market. Already in her introduction, Sarah, I think, referred to the need to address the fragmentation, the emerging fragmentation, the problem that the country of origin principle that has proven so important for the growth of digital service in Europe is put into doubt by many member states that are saying this old grandfather regulation doesn't deal with today's challenges, so we need to do this ourselves. We need to restore this, and I do agree with Sarah that 900 amendments on just one report show that everybody has interest in that. But it's not a problem. It is, we need to have this debate, right? We have to be able to define in Europe how do we want digital policies or digital technologies and business models to be regulated in Europe. That's a debate that we have to have. And then we'll see where it ends up. But signals so far are quite encouraging. If you read through the reports coming out of the European Parliament, it's not that they're all coming from very different planets, right? You may have disagreements here, questions there, but you see a lot of convergence towards single market, country of origin principle. Let's not undermine the key principles underpinning the e-commerce directive, including on the liability regime. Of course, we need to modernize it, we need to clarify it, but nobody wants to eliminate its fundamentals, if you want, right? So in that sense, I would see rather encouraging signs. Some more detailed questions by Elizabeth, probably go a bit too far now. If you refer to the Good Samaritan clause, a la United States, that's not what we had in mind. Our understanding of Good Samaritan was already spelled out in our recommendation on illegal content 2 years ago. This is not a new safe harbor. All we are saying is that the mere fact that a platform takes responsible measures should not be used against that platform. So in a sense that no judge should come around the corner and say, hey, you have those systems in place, therefore you're bound to have knowledge of everything that's happening in your platform. That is what we are trying to evacuate, this disincentive in acting responsibly. But anyway, I don't want to go into too much detail on that. The second part is then market power, and there's really two dimensions. One is the market power of digital gatekeeper platforms. It's a continuation of the business to platform regulation that we did in the last mandate, but this time zooming into the very powerful ones. There were really market power is concentrated in the hands of a few companies that are market makers in their own right, that are private regulators of markets, and at the same time compete on these markets with those others for whom it provides the market. So this is an old theme, of course, coming out of many competition cases, but also many other complaints and things we have seen in the last few years. So the question here really is, if you already have such gatekeeper platforms, should there be some limits as to what those players can do? Should we have some practices that we don't accept if certain criteria are met? So this addresses existing market power in some markets that are privately held and are very important for the economy. The DG competition tool, which is complementary to this, is part of the revision of the competition tools that we have. So it is our competition law fit for purpose. Again, a continuation of last mandate's work, the special advisors report and so on, where the frustration by relying solely on ex post tools has been very big. You know, it takes years to come to some conclusions by what time markets have tipped 3 times and any competition may have disappeared. So is there a need for an ex ante type of tool that would allow, based on market investigations, to help intervene before markets have even tipped? So in that sense, it's complementary to the other instrument that is meant to address market power problems where market power already exists in the hand of a few. The other is a more flexible ex ante tool to avoid markets from tipping in the first place. I stop here, otherwise I will talk for the next one.
Well, thanks. I hope hopefully everyone can be maybe flexible for 5 minutes, because I think there's just a couple more things before final questions for you all, but thank you, Werner. I think this is very useful for everybody. I have a question though from Victoria de Posson of CCIA, who said that she has some information from DG Grow, the IP unit, that the Commission might publish recommendations on the fight against counterfeit on the side or part of the DSA, and we're wondering whether you have more information on that. And then one question from participants, just to make sure everyone gets a chance. Perhaps Werner and maybe someone else in the panel will want to react. Much AI innovation and adoption has been driven by private companies, and as governments and society will count the cost of COVID-19 fiscal stimulus and reevaluate the private sector relationship with government, what might this mean for future claims on value generated? So Werner, just again giving you the floor real quick, and then perhaps to the next one after.
Okay, just quickly on the counterfeit point, because I'm not totally sure I understood the second question, but probably some other panelists have good answers. Victoria, I don't know exactly what you're talking about. I know what you're talking about, but I don't know whether what is behind that. One thing is clear, that the DSA is not going to replace everything else that has happened in this space, right? It is neither going to override all sectoral legislation that has addressed already legal content in one way or the other, nor is it the ultimate solution to all illegal content problems. So there will always be some coexistence between the DSA and sectoral legislation, but also between legislation and self-regulatory activity. There will be certain things that we can do in the DSA that will, of course, also have a bearing on counterfeit products, for instance. So if we harmonize notice and takedown procedures, if we improve the cooperation between platforms and law enforcement authorities, if we, for instance, work towards know your customer obligation when it comes to business sellers on platforms. So things like this, they would, of course, have a direct bearing on counterfeit. But if there is other things that can be done over and above those new legal provisions, they will of course be pursued further on. So that doesn't mean that the DSA is the end to any other thinking that may go on in one sector.
All right, thank you very much. Now let's do a proper closing. So of course, then I would love to hear you for another couple of hours, and we probably will have a lot of debates on this ex-ante regulatory tool. You've hinted at. I'd like to ask each of you perhaps your final thoughts, regarding the overall EU tech agenda. Back to that, what makes you optimistic? What makes you impatient? Any lessons learned during the crisis? And truly, if there's anything else you'd like to close on, please feel free. Let's start with you, Cameron.
I just want to come back to a point that I think there's more agreement than meets the eye. Werner talked about some of the work on platforms and competition. That is certainly very much a concern on the US side. The Department of Justice Antitrust Division is looking at these issues. Certainly politics drives some of this. There's motivation on the right, sort of concerns about perceptions of the politics of tech companies or content issues. But there is bipartisan concern about their power. Werner talked about the work of Commissioner Vestager's expert group, which I think informs the DSA in important respects. And I think that was a very thoughtful product of analyzing how you look at the power of data, the economic power of data. And that, I think, is a subject of concern on both sides of the Atlantic.
Thank you, Cameron. Thank you for the extra time. Sarah, would you like to follow up on that or make your final comment?
I agree that there are common values, both sides of the Atlantic, generally around the world, particularly around AI. We've seen that with the ethical principles that are agreed largely on a global basis. I think this is the best time for international collaboration around some of these topics, and to dial down protectionist language and behavior, and to work together around global challenges. One final remark just on the competition aspect and the ex-ante regulatory proposals. Aline, I just want to recommend a webinar that you were on the other day with Andrea Schwab and somebody from Google and somebody representing the SME community, having a fantastic debate about the pros and cons of ex-ante regulation. So may I recommend that as a good listening hour for your audience.
Thanks, Sarah. Elizabeth, please.
Sure. Well, I think to echo again some of what Sarah said, I should go first next time. I think COVID has actually shown the importance of collaboration. Some of the things that are happening have been amazing collaborations of large companies and small, of state and private. And I think that is a great learning. And I just say that I hope we can hold on to that as we go back into our silos and remember that we need to look out of them and upwards so that we don't miss the bigger picture.
Thank you very much. So I think we should keep it to that, just being mindful of time for everybody. It's not the end of the day for us all. I'd like to thank you to our distinguished speakers and techUK and you all participants for making today's conversation happen. So clearly the EU's tech agenda is gearing up to take off the dust on many issues. And I think we all commend this effort, not to overlook how key digital is for the future. I hope to meet you soon on a terrace in Brussels. Thank you all again. This was a very interesting conversation. Sabina, over to you.
And just a big thanks from me too. Thanks for being here. Thanks for joining Cameron all over from Boston this morning. And thanks to all our other speakers. And I'm sure this is just the start of the conversation. So look forward to picking it up again soon. Probably after the summer, because for the summer we'll all be busy with DSA.
Right.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.
I appreciate it.
Bye. Thank you.